All right, it is time for the rest of you to add to what I have shared from this passage, maybe perhaps from your own studies. Perhaps you need clarification from something that I said. Whatever the case is, just remember, this time right now is for a continuation of what I have been talking about, what we have been studying. And if you would like to add to it, please just make your way to one of these mics, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Well, I just wondered if you could talk about, as far as clarification, because in Matthew, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, when he talks about lust,
Yes.
adultery.
Yes.
So it's
Matthew chapter 5.
verse 27.
Great. What's your name?
Don.
Don has asked the question. There are people watching online, and for the recording. Don is asking the question about Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 5 regarding lust and adultery and its connection to adultery.
I've always viewed pornography in that fashion, where Jesus says if you look at somebody with your eyes, you're committing adultery in your heart.
Yes.
And so, for me, it's always been true.
Right. So this is Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So there's some important words here. There's some important understanding to see. When Jesus talks about lustful intent, what he means is given the opportunity to actually engage in sexual immorality with the woman, you would. In other words, it's already happened in your head, right? It's as good as done. All that you need is the opportunity, right? You've already committed adultery with her in your heart, right? That's a very different thing, right, than looking at pornography. Because when you look at pornography, you're not necessarily already decided in your heart that given the opportunity, you would have sexual intimacy with any of those women. In fact, many men who view pornography would not ever actually have a real affair. And so that's the important distinction here is the intent. It's as good as done, right? Rather than fantasy. Again, it's like anger, right? If given the opportunity, I would murder that person. Well, then you've already committed murder of them in your heart, right? That's different than being angry with them. That's the way that this all becomes consistent. That's the way this becomes consistent. So I'll let you wrestle with that. Obviously,
It's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, we can agree to disagree. And that's fine. I mean, the heart is really the core of our relationship with Jesus.
Yes.
It's the heart.
Yes.
And if we do something that defiles our heart, then that is just like doing it in reality. In my mind's eye.
Sure.
Because it's
What Don's saying is if we do something in our heart, that it's a big deal. And that's true. And like I said in my message, in no way are we reducing the serious nature of fantasy and pornography and all the other various versions of it. We're just differentiating it from oneness, right? There's something unique. There's something unique that happens, right, when we are one flesh. And in Matthew 5, Jesus is pointing to that. This as an internal act of that, of one fleshness.
I just want to, I think this passage, I don't disagree with anything that you said, but I think it's telling us more, there's many levels on which Scripture is true, and I think there are spiritual realities that we don't necessarily understand, like what happens when two become one flesh. And many places in the Bible, God tells us that what's happening between a man and a woman, either when they're married or when there's sexual fornication, is just like what's happening between him and his bride, the church. And I think that's really hard to comprehend, but we probably should study that, because it's important that he's saying, he's many times calling his own people, they have played the harlot. They're the prostitute. I wrote them a letter of divorce. And so there's a lot more happening when we think about, so there's both earthly consequences and heavenly and spiritual consequences. And I think we can all think about, Jesus' death did not remove a lot of earthly consequences of sin, of which they are multiplied in this category of sin. And so idolatry, worship of false gods, but also the way in which God did not command, as you read with Abihu and Adab and Abihu. What he did not command, he takes very seriously, that is idolatry. They were, like you said, in the right place, and the right people. I think that they were intending to worship the God of their fathers, the right God even, but not in the way that he commanded. Very serious. And I also wanted to point out one thing that has been a revelation to me, that I promise I'm not judging anyone. God just showed this to me, and I think it's worth considering. So birth control is something that is generally considered an area of Christian liberty, but I just want to point out that God, if you go back to Leviticus, he talks about niddah and the uncleanness of a woman when bleeding, and he says 7 days after, then she does some stuff, but goes back to her husband. This is the point of ovulation. This is the point of which she's most fertile. And if you've been separated physically during that time, the man's sperm count is super high at that point. Like, this is designed to accomplish many things, but God is prioritizing life here. And, I totally not looking at other people's life and definitely not counting number of children. I'm just saying, let's consider there's spiritual realities here that may not be so explicit, that I think he wants us to dig into here. What does it mean if the two become one flesh? What does that mean to become one flesh with God? And when might we not be doing that when we should be? And what might we be doing that could be really causing a distance between us, maybe not realizing it?
Yeah, I think that gets to the design of the physical body, the design of sexual intimacy, the purpose for it, digging in deeper into and asking ourselves more questions about. This Paul addresses one layer, one facet of the sanctity of the human body, the sanctity of our physical nature, one purpose for it. But there's many others. There's myriad. And it is an important consideration for all of us to make in a world where it presents its own version. The world will present its own version of what the body is, what the body's for, the value of the body, what sex is for, the value of sex, etc. Yeah.
The simple fact of the matter is, God gives grace. God's grace is supernatural. And there's no way I could stand here and say that, oh, excuse me, Pastor, I fell into sin. A believer in the Lord Jesus Christ that knows better doesn't fall into sin. We dive head first. We dive in, because the power of sin has been broken over my life. So it's me and my selfishness that goes there in the first place. So to hear something like this be taught in the most amazing way that you just brought this out is is even more compelling for me to be able to share what I know I can share. And the simple fact of the matter is that God gives grace. Because if God doesn't give grace, in my opinion, he ain't God. If he is Father, it's even that much more overwhelming his grace is available. So the fact of the matter is, as much as I might hate how I want to behave, I could choose to not behave that way. And that's where the miracle, mercy, and the grace of God shows up. But if I say, oh, nobody's looking, oh, I'm hiding all the way up here in the hills, nobody's going to see what I'm doing. I personally, in my younger days as a believer, had 3 very important people in my leadership: the senior pastor, the associate pastor, principal of the school, and the music director. And when every one of them took that choice to go that way, honestly, before God, I could sense it on them. I knew they went there, and I would go home and beat my head against the wall. How dare you think that about your brother? They so defiled all of us by doing what they did. Just stupid me, baby Christian. I just knew it. They didn't look right. Something wasn't right. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks would go by and it would go public. This is no game. But if God can't give us grace to be able to walk in this, he ain't God. And there's no miracles. Jesus didn't do what he did. But I know he really did, because I know how to walk in that grace. But it's my choice to go there. So this is an overwhelming conversation, totally. But the power and the liberty in Christ that we have, there's nothing like that in the world. To me, that's the priority. Otherwise, we're all done, and it's over. Peace.
And it is true, but from what Don brought up, that there is a process that we go through to get to the place where, given the opportunity, we would, right? That there's a process there, an invisible, unseen process in the heart that we need to be aware of, and that process will happen before we ever actually commit the act and defile the temple in the way Paul's talking about, right? Becoming members one with another. And that's what we need to be aware of, the process too. Right?
So every time I think about this passage, I really just love that it starts with that phrase, everything's permissible, but not everything's beneficial. Because I think of how many people I know who have come to the Lord, and those big sin issues have really made them feel like they can't come to the Lord. And so I think, there is this place where we have to realize that forgiveness covers all of that. And also for ourselves, knowing that, okay, just because, again, what you said, like things are permissible doesn't mean that's God's best for me. And so I want to make choices to not, look at pornography, not take text messages from, this guy that, oh, actually he's really handsome, and I like I'm attracted to, like I have to set up those boundaries knowing that the Lord wants to guard me. Like he wants me to have the best because I'm his temple. He wants that temple to be clean. And so for me, like as Christians, our job is not to put rules around ourselves to have rules. Our job is to look to Jesus and say, God, where do those boundaries need to be for me? Because everything's permissible, but not everything's beneficial. And so I think those are the places where we have to really look to the Lord and say, okay, God, what is the best for me right now? And knowing that he's going to make that clear. If I'm pulled in a certain direction and I know this is not going to be good for my marriage, then I need to stop and I need to turn around and I need to look to Jesus. If there's any feelings there, like I have to be able to say, okay, this is going to lead me down the wrong road. It might be permissible for me to be texting somebody, but it's not going to be beneficial. Like there's something there that's getting in the way of my marriage. Like that's not good. And so I think when we go into these conversations, being able to really take that as the key of like, this is how we walk it out for ourselves and to know that, no, God isn't going to say, you're damned to hell, because he brings forgiveness, right? Like that there is those places where if we mess up, because we let ourselves go down that road, like that the Lord has forgiveness for us, no matter where we are on that journey. And also that he has clear boundaries for us that we can follow that will keep us from, the bad. So.
Good.
You go first. Okay. Sorry. Hi, I'm Katie. So it's interesting that this topic is when I come back. So I was gone this week. I was in Missouri visiting family and friends. And my friends who are there, they're moving actively. So I knew them in California. And they're moving back to California. But they've been kind of in the mess of, I don't know if all of you know of the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. So they were in that church. She actually grew up in that church, and all the stuff that's surrounding that church right now in regards to sexual immorality. And that's just one of the stories. So I was having lots of conversations with her just about how they're processing that, how they're, it's just a lot. I mean, especially for her. I grew up in a church that I knew if I knew all those things now, that would be mind-blowing to me. So kind of her just processing relationships and different things that she had that went on. But I guess for me, it's just kind of a reflection of talking to her about that. She was even just showing me some other things, and then even just seems like every year there's things that come out, whether it's Hillsong, whether, you name it. I guess for me, I would love to hear your perspective, kind of what we were talking about, right? It begins at the heart. It doesn't just happen. There was things that happened in my church where you realize over time there was choices that were made to come to that point. And so I would just love to hear your perspective, as this is obviously something that is constantly coming up in the body, in leadership. And what that maybe, it's been happening since the beginning of time, but it's just interesting. And it was very sad for me to just hear another church leader falling to that. And then in this particular situation, it seems like it's a little bit more messy. It's not just like, hey, this is what I did, I'm so sorry, please forgive me. And so it's just interesting hearing her perspective, seeing things in the news, and then obviously, like I said, seeing things just over time as these come up. I would just love to hear your thoughts on that with the leadership. I don't even really know what my question is, but it's just something that, I would just love to know.
Sure. It's pretty clear to us as leaders that isolation, insulation is what brings leaders down, because there's nothing special about a leader in terms of their humanity. And so, like every human being, we all need human connection to be healthy. And when it comes to our relationships, our marriages, and other relationships outside our marriages that could lead to this, the biggest problem is that leaders, and I know the stories of leaders, who fell in sexual immorality. I know the details of many of them, and that's the one thing they all have in common, is they either pursued or allowed isolation and insulation. So they basically cut themselves off from love, the love of brothers, the love of family, of the church family, that would be there to have their backs, to see the little compromises, to recognize there's something wrong in the marriage, there's something not healthy with this, with that. And so they get isolated. They allow it, they pursue it, and the church allows it. And those around them allow it. It has to be the combination. Those are my thoughts.
I think the Isaiah 6 narrative is super helpful. when considering this topic, but I was wondering during worship, this other narrative came up in my head, and I was wondering if it has relevance in this conversation. It's Luke 8, starting at I think it's verse 42, in between there. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that the power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And I was just wondering, is this the kind of restoration we're looking for? This idea of you can almost bleed out when you don't have a sin that's confessed or healed. I wish I had more answers to this, but I just wanted to see if someone had a better interpretation.
Sweet. Well, certainly her bleeding could have been the result of what we're talking about. It's certainly a possibility. One of the consequences of sexual immorality is physical. And whether it's disease, injury, or whatever. And it just, again, I think it's a great reminder. Nicole brought it up. I mentioned it briefly in my message. When we live contrary to God's design, there's always, it always distorts, degrades, and defiles. And this is why we need to come to the table. This is why we need to take communion often, is to remind ourselves of what Jesus did in our place. He was distorted, he was degraded, and he was defiled, so that we could be made clear, restored, upgraded, and cleansed. And it's also a reminder that whatever the source of our need for Jesus is, it may not be perfectly relevant to this passage, but we all need his ongoing cleansing to stop the bleeding, so to speak, to stop the consequence of our sinfulness to continue to ravage our lives, because it will. And so we don't just need him at a point in the past. We need him every day. We need him constantly. And we are so dependent. So whether you know you need to be healed, whether you know you need the touch of Jesus, or you don't know, you do. We all do. So let's as we prepare to take communion, let's go before him. And like that woman, let's touch the hem of his garment and seek to be healed once again.